in his 88th year. Throughout his life, he has been a member of the Methodist Church. He has been a minister in that church for some 40 years. He is now in a kind of exile, forbidden to preach, forbidden to speak with his superiors in the Methodist Church. And the reason for this is that he has insisted that he tell the truth about a scandal within the church. It all began as a minor affair here in Bexhill-on-Sea in 2014. A senior appointment was being made in the local district, and Reverend Timms complained that the rules of the church were not being followed properly. He was shouted down. After the meeting ended, he complained about the lack of impartiality that had been shown.
What I was asking for was for the minutes of the meeting in September, a September circuit meeting, to be fair and truthful and complete, because they were not complete and they were not reasonable and they were not fair. That had been signed off by the then superintendent, really, as being accurate, and they weren't. And he must have known they weren't accurate.
It was a simple complaint, but none of the senior ministers would accept that there had been favouritism in the promotion, nor that the minutes of the meeting were wrong. Reverend Timms took his complaint higher to his district chair, Reverend John Hellier, in Crawley. But he was told they would have to take his complaint to the headquarters in London. Here in Marylebone Road in London is the headquarters of the Methodist Church. They listened to Reverend Timms's complaints about impartiality and began an official inquiry. But that was when the problems began. The first letter that Reverend Timms received from the leader of the complaints panel was effectively a confession that he had committed several breaches of confidentiality, which was against the rules of the church. There were several confusing parts of this document. It stated, "I am the respondent in a complaint made against me." In fact, Reverend Timms was not the respondent. It was he who was making the complaints. The three ministers he was complaining about were the respondents. It also stated, "I understand that I was told in writing and orally that any breach of confidentiality could result in disciplinary action being brought against me, when in fact no such exchanges had taken place at all." The boxes which he was supposed to fill in looked as if it was a standard document used by all complaints teams. Had the wrong document been sent? The most confusing paragraph in this document was to complicate the entire complaints process and lead to the terrible situation in which Reverend Timms finds himself today. It read, "I understand that the connectional team has reviewed the evidence it holds and has determined, in accordance with Standing Order 1157, that there have been several breaches of confidentiality by me." Reverend Timms knew nothing of this. It seemed that some charges had been brought against him, that some judgment had been made on him, yet he had heard nothing of this and had not been asked to defend himself against the unknown charges. More than 2 centuries ago, the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, famously said, "It is impossible that it should ever be necessary for any reasonable creature to violate all the laws of justice, mercy, and truth." Such was Wesley's view on justice that it became common practice within the church to link holiness directly with social justice. But Reverend Timms discovered that John Wesley's views may no longer guide the Methodist Church today. For he realized that, when he complained about Methodist ministers breaching the standing orders on impartiality that they were sworn to uphold, he was dealing with what must be the only tribunal in the whole of England which can secretly place a man on trial without his knowledge, find him guilty, and then demand that he sign a letter confirming that the tribunal was right to find him guilty. The man who sent the false confession to Reverend Timms and repeatedly demanded that he sign it can often be found here at the Bayford Bray Observatory of the University of Hertfordshire, where he is a respected and distinguished astronomer. He has published many important books on the subject. His name is Professor Chris Kitchen.
The truth is that I was the person making the complaint, of course, and I suddenly thought and realised that somehow I was being investigated. It was me that was actually being looked at in some kind of way. I had no idea what they were talking about in terms of what I'd supposed to have done wrong, but I was invited, indeed told, under threat virtually, that I was to sign this confession, which would, of course, was a false confession, because I'd done nothing wrong at all at that stage.
He refused to sign the document. The inquiry began in September 2016. Over the next 3 months, the leader of the panel continued to insist that Reverend Timms should acknowledge his guilt. He withheld documents from him until he signed the confession. He forbade all contact that Reverend Timms might have with potential witnesses until he signed the confession. Explanations of procedural difficulties were withheld until he signed the document. And then Reverend Timms found that he was being lied to.
I was concerned and at that stage, and asked the panel leader if I was being investigated, and he said, well, he couldn't tell me at that stage, because I knew that under Methodist rules they were not allowed to investigate me prior to investigating the complaint that was made. But clearly that had happened and was happening. And of course that was the reality. They started investigating me and had taken briefings about me, which really was quite wrong. It just wasn't according to the rules. And so I was rather puzzled and somewhat a bit upset that they were approaching it in that kind of way of treating me as a whistleblower without really any good cause.
Another lie, or at least an ambiguity, was an allegation that Reverend Timms had demanded that he be given a senior position in the church. In a list of questions, Reverend Timms was asked, "What were your reasons for thinking you could take on the superintendency?"
Where that came from, it's hard to say. It certainly didn't come from me, that's certain. At no time did I ask to be considered, nor did I wish to be considered for the superintendency.
However, when this matter of him wanting to be a superintendent was queried, the leader of the inquiry wrote, "I don't know where Peter finds his information. He is not being accused of asking for the job of superintendent." So was Reverend Timms accused of this or not? 2 letters from the same person contradict each other.
There were repeated questions that had within them suggestions that I'd done something I shouldn't have done. So the whole thing was being turned against me. I was no longer the complainant, but I was being complained against. I suddenly became the object of the complaint, which really was quite contrary to any sense of justice or fairness. But that's the way the group that we're dealing with, the connectional team, handled the matter.
Reverend Timms was also told that if he wished to call witnesses, the inquiry panel had to interview them before he could talk to them. He could bring a friend to the hearing, but that person could not say anything. And there was a restriction on the length of the 3 complaints he was making.
The chairman of the panel said, "All right, we'll receive what you have to say, but it'll have to be on an A4, no more than 1 A4 sheet of paper or less." Now, bearing in mind there were 3 people concerned, it seemed to me to be a nonsense to actually start limiting. And what's more, there's nothing in the Methodist standing orders that requires that.
Reverend Timms contacted the church's executive at Methodist Church House in London. He wrote to Reverend Gareth Powell, the secretary to the Methodist Conference and the most senior person in the executive. He informed Reverend Powell of the incorrect procedure being followed and asked him to intervene. Reverend Powell informed him that there was nothing to be done. Six weeks into the inquiry, Reverend Timms was taken to hospital with heart problems. A delay in the inquiry was agreed. When he came out of hospital, he was put under covert surveillance. A few weeks after this, he attended this church to give a talk. It was a long-standing engagement. He was still ill, and only lasted 7 minutes before he had to sit down. When he felt better, he said goodbye to his friends in the church and drove in his car a mile or so across Bexhill. He went to a residential care home where he ministered to the old people when he was well. He told them he would soon be well enough to come to visit them as usual. The reaction from London was swift. They reneged on the agreement to delay the inquiry. It was to go ahead, even though Reverend Timms had been in hospital.
The inquiry team leader said to me, now that you're well enough now, I think he believed I was faking. And I said to him, well, you can talk to my doctor and I'll get it. I obtained a doctor's certificate. I wasn't interested in the certificate really. He was just interested in finding out whether I was faking. It was his way of trying to trap me into saying I was faking and I'd really faked the illness, of course, which was absolute nonsense. I was in hospital, and then he moved. Although we'd agreed that the actual my part of commenting to the panel would be in January, he moved it forward back, and he moved it back a month, so that disabled me from being able to do anything at all.
What actually happened in this incident shows to what lengths people would be willing to go to stop Reverend Timms's complaints in their tracks. Only the leader of the panel and 3 local ministers knew that the inquiry had been delayed because of Reverend Timms's illness. Yet someone here knew that he had been ill and that the leader of the inquiry would think his appearance at the church was important. Similarly, someone here at the Old People's Home knew of the delay, and that his arrival there would be of interest to the leader of the inquiry. The inquiry's delay, due to illness, was a close secret. No one privy to such details attended at the church whilst Reverend Timms was there. How did anyone know the secret? Similarly, there was no one connected with the inquiry at the Old People's Home. No one there was supposed to know the secret of the delay in the inquiry. Yet clearly someone did.
When I visited the church at Sackville Road and the Old People's Home, there were no ministers there, nobody involved or knew anything about this complaint that was being investigated, and yet on both cases it was fed back to the chairman of the connectional panel that somehow I'd been to both places. Nobody had any idea, or should have had any idea, that what was happening to me, and yet they did. So somebody told them. Somebody actually arranged for them to feed back to the connectional panel in some way that I'd been at both venues, quite separately, quite distinctly.
Parliament has a role in this aspect of the affairs of the Methodist Church. for the church is overseen by the Methodist Church Act of 1976. This expects the church to act in accordance with its central doctrines. The central doctrine of the Methodist Church is expanded in this document, the Constitutional Practice and Discipline of the Methodist Church, or CPD. One of the guiding principles in this document states that there must be justice, openness and honesty, and that each member of the church is responsible for his or her own acts. Covert surveillance, as was used against Reverend Peter Timms, is therefore not allowed. Informing on a complainant in secret to an inquiry panel, as was done in this case, is strictly forbidden. Being faced with a blatant breach of the CPD, the inquiry panel went along with it, even though it was a breach of the central doctrine of the church. However, they appear to have realized their mistake, for they later told a different story. It seemed that they wished to cover up their misdeeds. There was a lack of justice, openness and honesty in this, of which Parliament, considering the Methodist Church Act of 1976, would surely disapprove. The reason why the panel deliberately obstructed Reverend Timms's case was very clearly based on information from someone in Bexhill. You are now well enough that you were able to fulfil your commitment to speak at the Monday Fellowship at Sackville Road Methodist Church on Monday, 7th of November 2016, and visit the MHA Richmond Care Home. We therefore intend to complete the rest of this complaints process as soon as possible and will not wait until January to fix a new date to interview you. Reverend Timms asked Professor Kitchen how the panel had obtained the information about his movements around Bexhill. He received no reply. Professor Chris Kitchen's accusation was that Reverend Timms was clearly well enough to attend a hearing, and that was why the hearing date had been brought forward. But when Methodist Church House received the final report, the professor's story had changed. He now claimed that Reverend Timms had submitted lengthy paperwork and was therefore clearly not ill. The report stated, the team believed that as he was well enough to write, collate and send these documents, he would have been well enough either to speak with us or to answer our much briefer questions in writing. This was not the original reason for changing the date of the hearing. It was potentially a lie to the church to cover up the covert surveillance. For no one in Methodist Church House, not even the most senior executive Gareth Powell, had heard about the spies that had been set upon Reverend Timms in Bexhill.
Long before the report was completed, and I complained about the process, that I felt what was happening was wrong, and I believed that the people in Methodist Church House, I believe in their integrity. I believe that somehow there must be a way of checking against a process that was clearly ill-conceived and in some ways almost corrupt. It was just wrong. And yet, I was a bit disappointed about that. The most distressing thing is that the church in this has broken its own rules to shut me up, to keep me down, really to say, just go away.
Despite the evidence, the Methodist Church authorities remain intransigent against Reverend Timms's objections. The President eventually wrote that what had happened was within the parameters of the rules of the Methodist Church. The legal department wrote, there was no right of appeal against the complaints team. No person or body has the authority to set aside the decision of the complaints team. I do not believe that any further mechanism can be offered to you. As the executives of the Methodist Church who wrote these intransigent statements walked these corridors every day, they pass wall posters which detail the role of the church. The posters tell them that the Methodist Church believes that God's love is offered to everyone, that their worship should increase awareness of God's presence and celebrate God's love. They are told that they are there to help people and to be a good neighbour. They are to challenge injustice. The intransigence on the part of the executive in the church, in the case of Reverend Timms, may be due to their interpretation of Clause 8 in Standing Order 1100 in the Constitutional Practice and Discipline, the Rules of the Church. This states that there should be a means of ensuring compliance with any decision. This appears to be what the Church has been trying to do for the past 4 years or so in the case of Reverend Timms. However, that particular clause is preceded by 2 overriding clauses, numbers 5 and 7, which qualify Clause 8 and place the need for compliance into its proper context. These read, "The process should be fair," and "There should be a means of correcting any errors which may be made." In other words, the compliance which the Church has been trying to enforce upon Reverend Timms may only be achieved if the process used against him was fair and without any errors. That does not appear to have been so. We are all judged by the moral integrity of our actions. The Methodist Church today appears to sanction the use of false confessions accompanied with threats. According to the president of their governing body, that is within the parameters of their codes of conduct. Lying to people is also apparently allowed. The lies told to Reverend Timms come within the parameters of their standards of behaviour. Forms of questioning deliberately designed to trick people is also sanctioned. For that too is apparently within the parameters of their codes of conduct. Anyone who complains about any of this may find themselves spied upon, just as Reverend Timms was spied upon. For that too is apparently sanctioned by the Church's code of conduct. We are all judged by the moral integrity of our actions and decisions. The years go by. After 7 decades of faithful and loyal service to the Methodist Church, Reverend Peter Timms is now entering his 5th year of exclusion, solitude and sorrow, and his 3rd year of suspension, all because he refuses to sign the false confession that the Complaints Inquiry Panel and Professor Chris Kitchen sent him. He was the man complaining, but it was he who was judged and found guilty in secret session, without him being told anything of the charges. He believes that the Methodist Church is now hoping that death will rid them of this troublesome priest. The words ring in his ears. There have been several breaches of confidence. He demanded to be made a superintendent. You have been seen in Bexhill. You are well enough to attend. These were all lies put to him by distinguished members of the church that he loves. The Methodist Church now threatens legal action if this film is not taken down from the internet. They seek to cover up their secrets. They claim that this film is economical with the truth, but when challenged to support that view, they cannot quote one single mistake in it. They occasionally harass Reverend Timms with spurious accusations of criminal acts. only to retract those lying accusations when challenged. They seek to increase the agony they have heaped upon his head. Above all, they demand that he must accept the false confession and the lies that go with it. Letters to Chris Kitchen, who sent the false confession, along with those sent to Gareth Powell, who is in overall charge of the church's executive, all lie in a pile in Church House, unread. John Hellier demands complete subjection to his will. The persecution is relentless. The cover-up of this scandal goes on.